All right, welcome everyone to our last panel of the day, which is called Tracing Agency, Mormon Women in Historical Context. And this panel is going to consider how Mormon women have negotiated identity, power, faith, and belonging across time. These presentations use historical context to deepen our understanding of the many forms agency can take in women's lived experiences. And so once again, today we have a great moderator joining us. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm supposed to be speaking in here. I apologize. Yes. Once again, we have a great moderator joining us today for this panel, and that is Elizabeth Mallam, who is currently in her fourth year in the history PhD program here at Claremont Graduate University. In January of this year, she passed her qualifying exams and is now looking forward to starting her dissertation on working class and work on the working class and Mormonism in post-World War II Britain. She specializes in global Mormonism. And I have known Elizabeth for the last 2 or 3 years here at CGU, and I've been a huge fan of her from the start. You can find her award-winning article in Dialogue. We also have Makato Hunter. Makato is a graduate student in American history at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She researches the intersection of religion, sexuality, and the law during the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era, particularly in the ways plural wives experienced federal courts and law enforcement. I've known also Makato for a year or two, and I can say that she is one of the people that is just producing the most exciting work out there. Amanda Hendrix-Komoto is an assistant professor at Montana State University in the Department of History and Philosophy. Her research focuses on the intersections of religion, sexuality, and colonialism in the American West. Her recent book, Imperial Zions, Religion, Race, and Family in the American West and the Pacific, argued that Latter-day Saints created their understandings of polygamy at the same time they tried to change the domestic practices of Native Americans and other indigenous peoples. This volume ultimately places Latter-day Saint discourses about race and peoplehood in the context of its ideas about sexuality, gender, and the family. And Amanda is someone whose work I always want to read, so we're very privileged to have her here as well. Dr. Martha Bradley Evans, she is our last panelist. She is an emeritus professor in the College of Architecture and Planning at the University of Utah, and she has taught history and theory there. Between 2002 and 2011, Dr. Bradley served as the Dean of the Honors College, where she currently teaches. Among her many awards, she is the recipient of the University of Utah Distinguished Teaching Award and the Student Choice Excellence in Teaching Award. She has served as the Vice Chair of the Utah State Board of History and Chair of the Utah Heritage Foundation, and she is currently the Managing Director of the Smith Pettit Foundation. She and Smith Pettit have also been outstanding supporters of our Mormon oral history collections. So she holds a special place of esteem here at Claremont Graduate University. So everyone, welcome, and I am excited to hear your presentation.
Study for introduced her 1880 novel Southern North Come. She emphasized how little agency Mormon women have. They lived under polygamy, a marvelous system that she wrote numbered book of slavery. Were allowed with more at the validity because the pro like the do or the pro was put forward the federal government or over being otherwise labels only silence. For anti-movements like Bartlett, agency was central to their activism. They believed that normal marriage was such a not just born in intimacy, such an unthinkable kind of marriage that its very existence implied the suppression of agency provided externally. The concept of agency completely is exactly motivated their writing, their speeches, their politics. Yet as much as the idea of agency motivated anti-progressiveness, so too the existence of agency, the devil. Activists like Bartlett had expected the plural lines to receive not more than the first years. But what the United States are set up important anti-belief legislation to be inside the country. Federal marshals and prosecutors in, instead prefers to subvert their efforts to stamp out bullying. There were women like Belle Harris, Ellen White, and dozen others who would also display as witnesses but refused to testify and ultimately to held in court. Numerous other plural wives went into hiding in order to fight cry prosecutors of the added for political convictions, adopting subpoenas, hiding monthly cake, the underground, and the different plural wives insisted that the whole commonwealth that the whole time giving plural marriage had expressed their conscious choices or believe the marriage that and by Lady Newshawk. In her mind, in a world full of novelist etchies, plural marriage was the obvious choice. In Ellen White's words, quote, if the husband and the wife agree that other wife shall be taken with them, and she agrees to become that wife, and use such a matter, marriage can have salvation and religious view, do you think it wrong or anybody's business to interfere with the arrangement? And both in agency was what mattered, on others. But according to Peacewood, America surely had to tolerate religion because, or in that case, their defiance of innocuous norms but precisely would express their cadence, their willingness to make an unthinkable choice was exactly what they wanted to choose. Argue the question of desirability of contemplation and approach. And had believed the tricky Ujib that she's in the strange times when a female Mormon Latin asked, I'm the give to you on a literary of self-degradation were anti-religionists, choices that hurt you, choices, the choice to enter a marriage couldn't possibly be a choice. How anyone who was willing to subject themselves to something so wrong in their minds could truly exercise their agency. And to some extent, there is a point. Pearl Mary was all sunshine and roses, despite the defenses and apologetics of Mary for Allah, even for many of those just mentioned. Belle cared to testify against her husband, and privately confessed to it out on others. What did agents you meet that in a context where one chooses, or what is agency in a context where the choices you make, the choices you build of yourself, also seem to haunt yourself? In order to clarify that, I suggest the frame. For anti-polygamists, plural marriage was an unthinkable marriage, an impossible choice, a choice that could not be chosen. But when fur wives offended this, good as we marry, they often emphasized how moral their desires were. Belinda Martin Pratt wanted to be married, but her experience was that other men had failed her, that other opportunities for monogamous marriage had been with men who were not virtuous. For her, getting married to a politician, carrying her money, would let her have would let her have the kind of family that she wanted, the kind of life which she could raise children and have to provide. It was her path to a normal life, have a garden and have a normal life. When Ida had little in the well marriage, she want she longed for she longed for what her descendants had of friendship. In the 19th century, women often had close, intimate friendships for Ida Hunt. One needed to come closer to her wife by sharing a husband was how she wanted something quite small, companionship and friendship. Over and over, we see it for a while how they understand that what they want shouldn't be seen as those visuals. Is it that every woman's right to decide who she actually they like? Isn't it every woman's right to decide who she marries? What anti-culturists did not see was that what they and pro Weinstein want to often very much the same thing. I characterize this way, in part inspired by the essayist Andrew Rock Chu. Chu writes about gender transition, not plural marriage, but for insight next to a strange soul. At their starts, it comes gender but this answer, non-normativity is what wanted to be more actually looks like. In and you see this all the time with all sorts of LGBTQ theories. What does it what do gay partners want? A loud connection, like normal in America. Women and people want set to be seen as what this is not, but normal for any man or woman. What does it for a wife want? At least in the 80s, but have children with a man she trusts. In in the end, in the end, our desires are those of the moral. But the ways they go out them end up being us abnormal. In Shu's words, we really want things shook because the way that it we really want the things shook. After Christmas, uh, oh, when I would find that he get this book about David's and funding by the people at the UCF. And they're very country for a while. I had to give it a lot of thought because it is a subject that I'm talking about in some ways over and over. Constantly wonder how much agency for a while, how much agency libraries in past and present or in past. It was hard to try to think of something new to say or something at least worthwhile because you all have probably heard many of these conversations before. What I run was this. That in their exercising agency, plural wise will not store one per cap, will not so perhaps so that is raw. Did not have a musical they were for achieving plural marriage, but rather how ordinary they were. For one for yeah.
There we go. That was really beautiful. I love the idea that you just shared with us about how normal and ordinary these desires are, even if they're achieved in different ways. So today I'm going to be talking about Minerva Teichert. This was not the first slide I expected, but that's okay. Let's restart. Maybe not. All right. I will talk and bring it up at the same time. So most Latter-day Saints know Minerva Teichert's art really well. And when they think about Minerva Teichert, what they tend to think of is her art that is focused on temples and on church history itself.
Why is this not going to the slide I wanted to? But today I want to focus on a slightly different Minerva Teichert. So apparently this is going to be the only piece of art that I show from Minerva Teichert until I bring up Drawn Memories from the Church History Library in a minute. But that's fine. So I'm in a department of environmental historians. And as a result, the way that I think about agency and then environmental historians think about agency is slightly different than the way that other historians think about agency. Historians of the environment tend to de-emphasize human agency, worrying that it's our belief that we somehow control the natural world and make our own choices apart from the environment that has led to our current environmental crisis and climate change. Instead, they emphasize the importance of contextualizing our agency within that of what they call the more than human world or the natural world. They ask questions about how animals resist domestication and the relationships that farmers might form with flax. And today, I want to use that lens to explore Minerva Teichert's work and the multiple forms of agency that appear within that work. So those questions have introduced me to a different Minerva Teichert. In addition to painting murals in the Manti Temple, Teichert, and I've read about this in her letters, also drove to the post office to pick up baby chicks first thing in the morning before they died of thirst after being shipped through the mail. She also spent multiple hours worrying over the fitness of their cattle and whether or not they were going to survive. Perhaps her most famous relationship to the natural world, however, and the one that I want to talk about, focuses on the construction of the American Falls Dam and the pamphlet that she published, mourning the land that she lost as a result. So Minerva Teichert was born on August 28, 1888 in Ogden, Utah. Her father, however, owned a homestead near Pocatello, Idaho, where the family ate, quote, cottontail fried in butter, end quote, and too many potatoes, which I am adding as a child of a factory worker in a potato factory. Teichert attended high school in Pocatello before traveling to Chicago and New York for art. In 1917, she returned to Idaho and married Herman Teichert, a second-generation German-American whose family owned a homestead on the Snake River bottoms. Minerva continued to paint in this period. Local newspapers noted the success of an exhibition she held in Boise's Carnegie Library, and Marie Irvin, who's an Idaho artist in her own right, and also taught art at Boise St. Margaret's School for Girls, praised her art and its meaning for, quote, Idaho's place in the art world, end quote. Idaho's progress, however, came at a cost. In 1919, the Bureau of Reclamation announced plans to dam the Snake River and flood much of the surrounding bottoms land. The entire city of American Falls would have to be removed as a result. It was a massive undertaking. According to local historian Rick Just, quote, individual houses were moved by truck, larger buildings were put on rollers and pulled along a few inches at a time, and the Methodist Church was taken down brick by brick and reconstructed on the hill above the river, end quote. Teichert published a pamphlet called Drawn Memories, opposing the dam and publicizing the loss, and I'm going to bring it up on the Church History Library website right now. So I have seen this pamphlet. I almost owned a copy, but John Dinger, who I will repeatedly shame for this, bought a copy before I could and chose not to tell me about it and to take it himself. Let's see if it'll link to it here if I have to go to the actual thing. Okay, here we go. All right, so here it is, the copy I might have owned. Actually, this isn't the same one. It does have the blue yarn, though. This pamphlet most clearly demonstrates how Teichert saw the connection between community and land. She begins the pamphlet with an image of a figure riding through cottonwoods. We'll get there. There it is. And you can see the figure here riding through the cottonwoods. A lot of her early art, even though we don't think of her as a regional painter, does focus on Idaho and on the Snake River bottoms. The accompanying text suggests that God has blessed this land in particular, promising it would be, quote, a feeding ground for game through the long, cold winter, and that it had become an El Dorado for immigrants and freighters and cattle barons. Minerva felt that God's blessings were held in the land itself and that her family, her husband, her brothers, his brothers and sisters, and her little ones participated in those blessings through their connection to the land. And then she spends the rest of the pamphlet narrating the lives of the other members of the community. And we can quickly go to those. The Black-Eyed Daughters of Elizabeth West. Annie should be showing up soon. Oh, here she is. This is Annie West, who I've looked up in the census. She was a real person. The Dutchman, Fred Steiner, and then Bodie Watson, who, and I'm going to pause to tell you what he did because I love this image so much. Come on. Bodie Watson, who roped a bear in the desert and then led it home. And this is her drawing of that image. In one story, she tells the story of a man who worked as, quote, a trapper and a miner in Idaho in its early days, and then returned to Idaho as an old man to ensure that his bones were left on the Snake River. She ends the story with his body being laid to rest, quote, in a quiet nook where he used to sit on pleasant evenings and smoke in the long green twist, end quote. In the story, the man almost becomes a part of the land. Most people living near Minerva and the Fort Hall Bottoms believed their community lay in the people who comprised it. They believed they could place their homes on logs and could recreate that community in a new place. For Minerva, however, it was physical space in the environment that had created that community. For her, community could not be moved. When the Bureau of Reclamation flooded the Fort Hall Bottoms, they destroyed the ties the people had to that community, according to Minerva, and to the people around it. At the end of the pamphlet, Minerva tells her readers that, quote, there will be more gold buried at the bottom of this large artificial lake than was available outside of it. She recognizes that many people will found new communities, but believes that they will always be called by, quote, the lovely green bottomland, the perfume of its thousands grasses, the swaying of its soft green cottonwoods, the calling and screeching and hooting of its myriads of birds, and the quiet places where many found rest out of the busy world, end quote. She sees the loss of this space as a kind of death. And the last image in the pamphlet shows a man trailing his fingers in the water. It's unclear whether he's mourning the drowned and everything that's been lost, or whether he is himself dead. Minerva, of course, did not die when the Bureau of Reclamation flooded her home in 1926, but we can see the effects of this act on her later life. She became deeply skeptical of the federal government and of income taxes. When the federal government began to use Social Security numbers as a universal identifier in the 1960s and 70s, Minerva was deeply suspicious. She called it, quote, a viper, end quote, and feared that it had already, quote, crept up into the floor of the cow barn and granaries all over America, end quote. She insisted that people, quote, born to freedom did not want this viper in America, end quote. Her refusal to accept Social Security and the accompanying taxes, fund it, endangered their farm and led to rifts with her husband. I'm sort of on Team Herman here. I would also be pissed if my spouse almost lost her farm for Social Security taxes. She told her daughter Lori that it felt like the moment that the government had claimed their Idaho ranch and then flooded it. So I also do sympathize with her. The loss also affected other members of her family. Her younger sister, Annalise Scarron, is perhaps best known for her claim to have been translated into an immoral being when she was 53, and then for the New Age books that she published afterwards. She also, however, wrote stories about growing up in Southeast Idaho and what it was like to grow up in the Snake River Bottoms. Her spirituality was also deeply tied to her experiences as a woman and as a mother. She describes seeing her daughter for, quote, a day before she was conceived, and that same child asking if she would receive her. She first realized her spiritual power when she prayed that her daughter would live and saw a room filled with, quote, a warmer glow than her own dim muffled light, end quote. That night, she saw her daughter, who had been ill, restored to perfect health, and, quote, the open dome of heaven opened to her. Scarron often described spiritual power using water as a metaphor. In the celestial song of creation, she suggested that there was a river of life. Its waters more real and sparkling and alive than any singing mountain river, end quote. Unlike physical rivers, this river would never be restricted, retarded, or defined, end quote. It's important not to read too much into these descriptions, but I do think they suggest that Scarron saw the natural world as a source of divine power and as a metaphor for her own spiritual experiences. And I think it's interesting that she used the language of damning to talk about what happens when you stop that spiritual power. Together, Teichert and her sister Annalie ask us to pay attention to the natural world. In their writings, the natural world creates communities. It gives us access to God's blessings and connects us to the past. It acts on us even as we act on it. Consequently, understanding agency requires that we reconsider, or at least consider, non-human agency. This direction echoes how feminist historians are considering agency. Current understandings of agency emphasize the importance of examining women's actions within their social worlds, asking how they navigated male-dominated institutions and claimed power within them. Sorry, there's a fly up here. Environmental historians, it's definitely acting upon me. Environmental historians ask us to take those questions further to understand how women form relationships to the natural world and how it shapes them. To paraphrase one of Caroline's earlier questions, it asks us to consider not only what kind of lives and worlds women want to create, but also how the world creates them. Thank you.
Picture of a virgin to Vermont. My grandpa. Strange. The criminal faith? It good. When I was a little girl in Livonia, Michigan, my mother had a black bob haircut with extra short but stylish bangs. She wore lovely cotton dresses with tight waist and skirt and hidden middle sheets to do her housework. The 1950s Passwide had specific several prescribed by rules and regulations that restricted her movement to the world. Between 1972 and 1980, supporters of BBRA lobbied, marched, rallied, petitioned, liquidated, plan on hunger strikes, and committed acts of civil disobedience. Our mothers lived primarily in domestic world, ranging out from teaching out well to teach. But not long after the ERA traveled to Congress, opponents engaged in a battle that pulled them out of their traditional roles as housewives and mothers and put them in conferences, letter writing, and telephone call making campaigns. A grassroots campaign designed to put down the aspirations of the feminist movement and its supporters and restore America to the way it should be. It's probable that most of them were unaware of what plays in the long historical continuum of women's struggle for constitutional equality in the United States, or how important history they were living to above. Importantly, in the context of this theme, the conference theme, the women's movement of the 60s through 80s was largely about making choices. In the 1950s, over a century after the fight to end slavery, the civil rights battle with another generation provided an impetus for the second wave of feminism. Women have the vote, then the equal rights to them in the central temple of the struggle. In the 1970s, the ERA passed the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives on March 22, 1972, and a proposed 27th Amendment to the Constitution was sent to states for ratification. At that point, ratification seemed like the natural offspring of the social revolution of the 1960s, the Sioux revolt, the push for civil rights, and the subsequent cultural revolution that signified an intolerance of creation. Imagine. The House was rejected emphatically, creating a vacuum ready for transformation. The 2 years after Congress passed the ERA, the Mormon Church took an official public stand on the issue and initially pushed Barbara Smith, the president of the General Lee Society, forward, seeing the importance of having a female face behind the church's position, that a woman serve as the church's official spokesperson. As late as January 4th, President Kimball declined to comment about the ERA as him it was a political issue. But within a week after that statement, the Church News published an editorial opposing the ERA. And that editorial affected the political climate. While itself was not a statement of official policy, it was just short of it, and it was really widely disseminated and read. It pretended the official policy and campaign that would begin a year later. After February 1975, the first president formalized their opposition with an official statement against ratification. And Hitler's voice appeared, so the ERA could indeed bring up far more restraints and repression. We hear earning a cycle, feminine instinct. Not following not long after that, Ezra Taft Jensen, who was then a reformer as well, wrote all mission presidents a supplemental letter that said, at the Equal Rights Amendment issued activated in some states, we suggest that you encourage members of the church as citizens of this nation to join others in efforts to defeat the ERA. They said that the ERA would fail to recognize inherent emotional and biological differences between males and females. From that point forward, one of the defining lines was the theme of difference. Men and women felt more deeply distinguishable carded on the words of feminism and the ERA. At the same time, they struck at abortion, pornography, press, homosexuality, sex education, and sexual perversion. It was really a sweeping landscape of social change. A confusion between what was political and religious became sort of irrelevant. Our leaders called the meeting, set the agenda, couched the call in religious terms. And the religious people, the LDS people, responded to the instructions as if they had been called to work at the welfare center or planned a dinner. They understood the hierarchical organizational structure, their place, and perhaps more important, their role. At the official voice of the church, the Ensign published a series of articles that clarified the church's position, including speeches by church leaders on different parts of the issues around ratification, official policies that really left no room for interpretation or debate. In March of 1980, the church went all in, publishing an official pamphlet called The Church and the Proposed Equal Rights Amendment on Moral Issues, which is rhetorically a really significant move. During 1970, Mormons dominated state international year conferences, resulting in the election of conservative slate delegates to the National Convention that would be held in Houston, that include the opposition to ERA, abortion, any legislation that suggests lesbian lifestyle or alternate lifestyle choices. In Utah, 14,000 women attended the state conference. In June of 1977, and that is 10,000 more than they planned for. It's really, really a big deal. They came because they had been recruited by their state and ward leaders, 10 for support. And they voted overwhelmingly against every one of the national resolutions. Utah was sort of the only state to do that. This was what they interpreted as the feminist agenda that came out from the National Commission under President Ford. In many ways, the women's movement in the 60s and 70s was about fairness, equity of opportunity, education, wages, and inclusion. But it was also very much about expanding the choices that women have. Not i.e. to work or not work, to stay home, and only raise your children or share it out with your partner. A whole range of new creative ways to be all of those sorts of things that were our responsibility. And I know it's really difficult for young women, and how much of you can't even imagine this kind of moment. But there are many of us in this room, people smile, so you can your face, you figure nothing. I remember talking with Emily Thane during the interviews for my book, and she said to me, "You are so lucky that you had a husband who let you do a PhD." And Emily at the time was really a hero to me. She had raised a beautiful family, but a productive, happy life. Something to sort of poignancy in that comment over there. That reflected on what she thought she might have done in a different context with a different life. I never asked my husband if I could do a PhD, but I got married really, really young. So I was just starting my sophomore year, and it seemed like I just always went to school. So it wasn't her kind of a question. He was supportive of me, pitching him when needed, bragging about my grades, which was totally empathy, but also there was really, really relief when I was done. Emily was a published poet, an author, and a mother of five. She taught English and coached tennis at the U of U. She gave lectures across the country on peacemaking to churches and community groups and schools. She said at one time, Nell, and Nell was her husband, support emotionally as well as financially. had always lent me a freedom that I thrived on. Joey had been my most enthusiastic fan, convincing them of the crucial importance of my time away. She let go up to her little cabin that was 10 minutes away from her house. So not that big of a deal. But apparently that was the negotiation point for them. Who in our generation never took vacation from responsibility. I read back over the interviews for my pedestals and podium book, and I represented a group that included traditional stay-at-home mothers, teachers, educators, politicians, church leaders, women who had married, and those who chose to be single. And their experience of the church and the women's movement varied radical, but to a person, they cared deeply about the issue, about having their views represented and being engaged in the process of positive social change. And when I reviewed the history of those decades, I think so much of it came to a head at the IWY conference, and for me personally in the podium group. Were any of you at an IWY conference and voted? No? Two of it in Israel. Awesome. I have a range of houses and podiums, just after a really long column that's straight to how you get into the phone booth. You know that there are IWY conferences that played out across the country. The conversation that was probably the most important was the PRA, that abortion was also firecracker in the room. Differences between men and women about the topic. Georgia Peterson, who was the state legislator and organizer before the IWY, remember going to Idaho, they have a convention, and she said, women kept coming up to me and say, tell us how to vote, tell us how to vote. And I said, come to the caucus. And that was where she would tell them how to vote. And when she went, the room was capped. And when we were on the floor, along the spike of the room, we could think side that she was very struck by how informed votes more than the rich kind of women were. They desperately needed to learn the steps to have on college and government, not just how to vote. So she organized a sort of roadshow that helped women know the issues, how to vote, in turn shortening the vote no on everything. And it's interesting, in her interview, she said she didn't help them not vote, but there's a ton of evidence that she actually did. Personal statements to the other again, newspaper articles. So I'll buy that community. President Dempton sent a letter encouraging local leaders to encourage at least 10 leaders to each congregation to attend. That's why I'm working back in 2000. And some ingenious individuals like Dennis Carr, for example, piggybacked on Georgia Peterson's effort, which was called That's Governor Cell, and spread the word that Warren should vote no on everything. He really kept right in my mind, patriarchal organization, male authority systems, and coupled with the Benson letter, women who out there knew what they were supposed to do. And I think this created a terrible war of men, where women who in good faith attended the conference, believing they were fighting a good fight, and that they were categorically going down the ballot to vote no, because they had been told to do that. And I know for me, this was a key moment. I went to the IWY for one day, not a retreat, because my dear mother-in-law had told me that she would attend my treatise retreat, and that was partly in the wake of such a discouragement about becoming birth control. I don't know if you remember that. I'm really enthusiastic on that fight. Anyway, I went to the Women in Youth session, which was really awesome for me. About as a kind of goal for life. To see other people carry out those things was actually a really good experience to me. But anyway, I entered that voting booth, and I had not read the resolutions in advance. And I read them carefully on the spot. And I found there were only two that I could vote no on, out of like 30 appellations. The rest seemed reasonable and even desirable to me. Better early childhood education, child care, women in art museums, and so forth. And the tears just flowed down my face. I thought, am I being duped? Am I a bad person? You remember, I even thought, am I a feminist? And I have that one knowing I'm a feminist. But at that moment in time, it was kind of the embodiment of people. But I knew I had to start paying attention differently in my life. And I don't think I was the only one who had that experience. Many of us, maybe not as dramatically as I experienced it, but paused and said, sending women to the comments with instructions about moral training made women make impossible choices and certainly tested their moral issues. In the religious community, my instructed by attitude, rules, behavior, which you ought to apply it, so be over independent thought. All the essays, articles, and statements set up that very difficult moment in the winding. How Mormon women address the choices they have and lives around you, those enemies. Moral Earthcon in the 1950s, we just didn't think about any conflict between education and motherhood. There was no conflict because there were so few opportunities for women. I remember going to the Dean of Women and hearing a presentation, and she didn't know what most of the careers were. She said, my goal was never a career was to finish school, and I didn't believe much beyond that. Brittany Durham was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, a position held since 2002. And prior to her appointment to the court, she was a tribal lawyer, a graduate of Duke University Law School. She taught at Duke, BYU, and with the new Utah Chief Justice. She's been nationally recognized for her work in judicial education and her efforts to improve the administration of justice. Christine and her husband, George, navigated their education and family at the same time rather than sequential, which was actually really novel for that moment in time. She initially applied to Harvard, a Tertullian, but George did medical school, went instead and moved to college. And she said this was after the birth of our first child, so we're both juggling our academic schedule and our box. George finished at Harvard, got into medical school, so she had a kind of girl Burkhead to do his law school, but it worked out pretty well. When I get all them lawyers had, she said, your eyes just circulate or things have changed so dramatically. Christine was involved actively in fighting me for rightness. And when people have asked her about that, she said, never developed this totally satisfied answer to that question, except but I was trying in every aspect of my life to meet a fundamental obligation I felt were part of the gospel, namely my marriage, my family, my personal relationship with God. And it seemed to me that I could do that, and that I could accept the very complicated political, historical, and social question. I don't know, maybe my attitude worked well. If God doesn't like my politics, he knows where I am. He can find me, and since he hasn't so far. And of course, the bullshit just went away lots of miserably. This crazy, interesting period forced women to confront their dreams, the restrictions they faced, and negotiate how they would each of individuals move forward. This negotiation was personal first, and then between them and their partners or friends, and their ecclesiastical leaders when it about Sonia Johnson's experience and potential chaos that could result. Considering what they believed, what they'd been taught, and what they wanted their life to be at women. For me, this has been this Paul became meaningful in a different way a decade later, when by then I had 2 sons and 4 and strong daughters. Negotiating those questions held new force, new meaning, and important when I was thinking of creating a world where they could thrive. Thank you.
Yeah. You gotta be really close to me. And speak up. Okay. Thank you so much, everyone, for those wonderful presentations. I learned a lot, and I especially want that last phrase from Makato to be put on a tote bag. It was good, and I learned a lot about Southeast Idaho, where I live, more than I've learned in the last 12 years of living in Southeast Idaho. Explains a lot. And as one of the bunch of young women in the room, I learned a lot as well. So first of all, I want to discuss a little bit about methodology as well, and also
self-awareness that we need as a historian when we make judgments about people's agency, how we need to be self-aware and not impose narratives as well. But at the same time, historians, we love to make connections and patterns where we can see them because they make really good presentations and stories and dissertations. So I want to ask you, first of all, what similarities did you see in the across the expanse of Mormon history that you've studied, that you've gone into, the connections that you've made and similarities, but also how you avoid an anachronistic lens as well when doing that? And maybe start with you, Martha.
I've been thinking about this question all day. And you hear what this microphone? No. Because that's what it all comes down to, right? Mormon women have never been free agents, right? It's one of the reasons why I wanted to spend so much time giving you background around the 1970s and 80s and the fight against equalization, because we were surrounded by advice. You know, there were flyers about the fight against equal rights women on the board in the lobby. We heard it from the pulpit. He read the newspaper. It was in the newspaper in the Ensign, the New Era. We knew what was expected of us. And how do you make a real choice in that kind of environment if you're trying to be a good Latter-day Saint or a good Mormon girl? How do you make a choice that's clear of all that? Very, very challenging. Right? And you probably join all authoritarian environments that expect a lot of you. Can you imagine being a Mormon and making a decision that wasn't colored by the doctrine of the church or what you had been taught, what your parents expected out of you? And we have some of the expectations that are flying around us. So we're not truly free agents in this. Even if you're feisty and you've got a spirit to make decisions on your own through most of your life, when it comes to those really big ones, when it's so clear how the church feels about something, or the people you really respect, when letting down your Gana, for example, that's a really big deal for most of us. And so I think that question is a good one. But regardless of the generation, I know this is true in Nigeria. You look at uncertainty, the 70s and 80s, you just never could make the decision that wasn't colored by what your partner expected of you, your mother expected of you, your bishop, you really admired. All of that came to bear in a way that is so incredibly powerful. You just can't even explain it unless you go through it. So we're never free agents.
What do you think about that, Makato? And is there a difference between being colored or being influenced?
So, I'll try to circle back around to versus influence. When it comes to the question of how do we as historians, are we sort of making judgments of people's agency without being anachronistic? How do we find patterns without imposing values or sort of failing to recognize what's on the ground? To answer through an anecdote, which I know is not the most efficient way to answer, but I'm reminded of Sarah Clausen Jensen, who was a Danish Latter-day Saint in the 1840s and 1850s. And her bishop ends up sort of suggesting, hey, this is missionary that you should marry. He's got some kids, could look from his first wife. And she meets him and they decide to get married. And they do a great Baptist wedding because that was her Baptist branch president, not her Latter-day Saint branch president. And his first wife was in fact dead. I tell that anecdote because later in their life, the Clausens do become Latter-day Saints and they do enter plural marriage. But the most plural marriage sounding experience that Sarah Jensen had was back when she was getting married anonymously. To the extent, whatever patterns I see is that at least in the 19th century, women are always existing within structures that shape the kind of decisions they make. To the extent that agency was limited within plural marriages, it probably was within monogamous marriages too. also structured and connected by misogyny, by sort of patriarchal norms and stuff like that. But then that, of course, if you go turtle all the way down like that, that turns into all of us never ever have free agency, which feels extreme and feels not true to our own experiences either. I mean, the other choice you could make as a historian is just to listen to the source. Does this person say they had agency? Yes. Well, okay, sure, they did. But then that becomes the problem if you want to do history critically. And what happens when you just really don't believe them? So that's a bit of a walk. The last thing I would say is another quote from Andrea Chu, writing about gender, but I think again it's surprisingly true of marriage and plural marriage, is that you are rarely the sole arbiter of who you are. Like, most of us end our lives being interpreted by other people. The me that exists in my mind is, I have very little control over the me that exists in your minds, and you outnumber me. What that means for agency, what that means for the historical method and agency, about to go off track.
No, tell us, like people who maybe haven't used these methodologies before, what methods can you use to recognize and spot agency in the sources that you have?
The simplest way is look for what someone wants, look for what they do to get it. And if they don't get it, then don't let that, again, to answer through an anecdote, Ida Hunt Udall wanted to enter a plural marriage because she the way she explained it to her children is that she wanted companionship. She really admired some co-wives that she met and thought they had a great friendship, and she wanted that. When she gets plural marriage, she doesn't really get that. Like, she and her co-wife are never quite close in that way. It's sort of an off and on kind of situation, and she never really has the family that she wanted to have. Does Ida's inability so Ida takes actions to get what she wants, so she's an agent. Ida does not get the results that she wants, so that makes her not an agent. I think I tend to lean toward she's still an agent, just sometimes life is disappointing. Which I know is a bit, I know that's also just very true.
And going back to Martha, like how would you respond to that? So like, how would you go about looking for any forms of agency, even in the people that you may feel were blindsided in this instance?
Well, my preparation for this little presentation was different from when I was writing the book, because I was reading URL interviews looking for agency, right? It usually, when I read a book, I don't have that preconceived notion of what I'm looking for in my brain. I love to look through the sources, hear the voices, and then discover what that's at part of the research. We didn't ask them questions specifically about agency, but it was so clear that was front of mind for many of the women. And I think it's, again, just part of that era. I think there was such a conflict between women who were starting to move towards feminism and those who thought that feminists were evil. So they were suspect of even asking those questions or exercising your agency. And I think in a community like many of ours, you check yourself when you might over express how do you really feel, or I didn't want to act. So there's all this self-censor built into the way we are. I think we live in this community. But I didn't look for agency the first time around. I love giving your oral interviews, and I was thinking this morning how appropriate Heaven was emphasizing that in my presentation, where you guys are doing such amazing work on oral interviews. It's a really, really powerful way of creating a full picture rather than the more limited picture you might get with even with a personal history. I love how when you're doing an oral interview, you can watch their face, because you come up there telling the truth, they're not telling the truth. was thinking about this morning. I've done the oral interviews for many of my books. And I've interviewed 5 men who've had Alzheimer's. And I'll tell you, that's a special problem. You know, when you're going through interview, sometimes they're lucid and sometimes they're not. You just have to stick with it. You get the board getting permission. But oral interviews are so rich. You learn so much more than what they say, just from what the pictures on the wall or the gestures they make while they're talking. It's just, in my mind, I'm a huge fan of oral interviews. I'd be very best single scores you can get in regions wrecking the lives of women. Mm-hmm. So how do you do that with the kind of work you're doing, right? Well, there are certainly lots of interviews that you can find here at the bar.
So you'd say be intentional.
What?
So you'd say like be intentional, looking specifically for agency as you Amanda, did you have anything that you wanted to say on that specific question?
About how to find agency?
Well, one even before that as well, where we're talking about, how do you make and avoid comparisons between different eras? And how to avoid being anachronistic.
I have a couple of thoughts. I mean, first, one of the things that sort of looking from the 19th century to the 21st century on Mormon women's history that stands out to me is the role of motherhood and women struggling with motherhood. In the 19th century, when Mormon women talk about motherhood, there's definitely the mother in Zion language, but there's also the language of like the absent missionary husband and the sheer struggle of trying to maintain a farm and a household without your husband there. And then I was thinking, you know, with Minerva, even though she's not always ready, there's often a sense that sort of her domestic life is preventing her from achieving what she wants to achieve. And in mid-century women's writings, you'll see a lot of discussion sort of feeling constrained by just the sheer amount of housework and childcare that is required. And listening to women today, when women talk about motherhood, they'll talk about the joy of motherhood, but also that it can be constraining. And I think that's probably partially about the role of motherhood within Mormon theology, but it's also about sort of just never having the support or the resources you need, no matter how wonderful or terrible your husband is. As far as looking for agency and not being anachronistic, 2 thoughts. One, my favorite book in college, as far as a history book, was called The Great Cat Massacre, which is about the pure joy that some French workers took in killing cats. I will relate this in a second. What the author said, Robert Eric Darton, is that the reason he chose that moment is it's often at that moment in which things seem weird or don't make sense that you can find the spots where our assumptions about what's going on in the past aren't quite working, and you can begin disentangling them. And I don't always look for the weird, but I do try to pay attention to where things are sort of striking against my expectations, because that's when you can begin to pull it apart and see where the past has perhaps changed. With Minerva in particular, one of the reasons why I wanted to include Minerva in this book is I wanted to tell a story about Idaho that wasn't about conservative women doing very politically radical things. And then as I was reading her letters, Minerva started going on about Catholics and taxes, and my first thought was like, oh no, like how did I get myself in this situation again? But as you look back at her story, you can understand where she's coming from. And many people, right, have had an experience in which they felt that the federal government or a job or another person has somehow constricted them, and they react against that. When you place her experience with Social Security and running the farm against losing her farm, you can understand where she's coming from in her relationship from the federal government. And I think that's another instance where you look at where somebody's making you uncomfortable, and that's where you can begin unpacking your assumptions. My grandma is Catholic. I am not. I don't think Minerva would have liked me. Maybe one of her granddaughters who's still alive can tell me that she would have loved me. That'd be great. But I think looking for where things don't quite match.
Yeah, that's great advice. And yeah, go ahead.
So glad you brought up motherhood, because one of the things I thought when I reread the transcripts that you were what to use for our project was that so much of it was dependent on how lucky you were when your partner died. So You know, if you had a support system, that was fantastic. If you had a good partner. But think about Christine Durham, for example. She had to make a lot of accommodations and negotiations for to get her education, which she just never believed. But at 2 points in the interview, she said, but that's because I was married to George Durham. You know, then George Durham was what really made everything as robust possible, and she recognized the power of that. And then Emma Thang, remember, was she refers to Mel? She was a great woman and she accomplished great things, but Mel actually greased the way for her in important ways. So, you know, there's this circle around you as you're trying to express or exercise your agency. I mean, you might have a family or parents. My dad would support me in just about everything. I know that for a fact. But many women just don't experience that. And we're so advantaged we've got a supported superstructure and support.
Yep. My husband's at home with 6 kids right now. Well, I agree. Okay. Martha, you said you know, that we don't have free agents, but at the same time, like we can't call these women voting no duped either. So, like, is agency a narrow definition? Like, are there other words that we could maybe use as historians to describe a situation?
It's been interesting today because we've seen everyone sort of struggle with how they want to say agency, right? And it's been multiple ways. But for me, the word choice works better because they had this group of choices they could make. But with each one of those choices comes a consequence, right? I mean, your kids are home alone with your I mean, but every one of those choices then creates this sort of series of other things that will happen. And I'm here to tell you, even though I've been so lucky, I also have 6 kids. I had this full life. I had a PhD. I worked for the past 30 some years. But every, you know, when my grandkids had a presentation that I could go to, but the other grandparents good, that went back to my original choice to pursue that path. You know, so every one of our choices has this series of consequences. And I don't remember who it was today that said you just have to kind of up it up, but there is part of that. That's a really important part of it. You have to be super committed. What you see is the long view or the long one. But every choice you make has consequences, whether positive or negative. I'm sort of character.
How about you two? So, yeah, do you think agency is a narrow defined word, or do you think we can broaden it? I mean, Caroline talked about this in the introduction and different definitions of it. Like, how do you see it? And or has it become a stumbling block in any of your research as well? Like, have you just seen a situation where you struggle to see agency, or it's the wrong word to use?
So without getting too much into it, this is something that I wasn't quite able to get from outline into prose. You may have noticed that as I was presenting. But I think agency is going to be unavoidable in discipline, right? It's just so important to so many historians. But as I'm writing, I find myself thinking more about desire, about wanting, as I've mentioned. And that way I feel like I gain the opening to talk about women wanting things that they don't get. Again, not to just be quoting other theorists and turning this into a bunch of illusions that are a little too niche. But I think what's interesting about wanting is that wanting doesn't usually feel very agentive. Like, you don't sit down and decide, I am going to want to eat ice cream. No, you just want it. And you're always you want things that you shouldn't have. You want things that you wish you didn't want, and you want them anyway. And when it's not ice cream, when it's something much bigger, it's something like marriage, like decisions you make about your life, that's when desire becomes both very fulfilling and very happy. And that, I think, is where thinking about the plural lives I study and the agency they exercise, that's when it becomes very, very interesting as they grapple with desires they have that they're told either by non-Mormon America are wrong, or they're told by their Latter-day Saint community is wrong.
I don't, in my own work, talk that much about agency, although it's something that I occasionally consider. I think one of the reasons for me is when I'm teaching, I think it sometimes trips students up because they will talk about, and I sometimes teach in women's studies. I usually teach just in the history department, but my students often will talk about a desire not to be categorized, and that if a woman chooses something, then that's her choice, and then she has, done this great thing, and then that obviously is the right choice. And the reason they do that is they don't want to think about structure. And I don't think that agency has to completely take us away from structure and thinking about sort of larger communities. But I think if we're going to talk about agency in ways that don't make everything individual and that recognize that we exist in both social and political and other types of worlds, then agency is always going to need to be in tension with structures and communities. And the fact that, you were talking about, like, you don't want to say that there are no free agents. Because of my students, I actually tell them almost every semester without planning to, that free agency is an illusion. They never respond. I just keep talking. But the reason is that they are always sort of just focused on sort of like what the individual wants and not considering it within communities. And so I'm always like pushing against that and trying to get them to consider it within a larger framework. And so that may be partially why I haven't foregrounded agency as much in my own work. Oh, yes. I forgot you get to be involved. Okay. About that part. Yes. Any questions from the audience? We're in our own little world here. There we go. Oh, yes. Go ahead. Yeah, it was you.
I'm fascinated by this quantity because while I was reading on the streets, I have this idea of structures too. I found something, and this is a preliminary book. I found something about, and I was looking at Socrates, like because it doesn't find structures, power to structures. Okay, but I find when I'm digging in the rock street and I get that feeling that this woman is disconnected from her wati, then that is, that's that's been at the crux, and I just wonder if there is a way of really, because like as you said, you read some raw histories and you're like, I just don't believe them, right? You read some history and you're like, it's not, they say that you have see, I read some of those as well, and I just have this feeling, I don't know how to figure out yet. I wonder how you wrap with that, and so we're talking about, I had a theme of like outsourcing sovereignty. And I feel like they're connected somehow. I'm sorry if you have any thoughts on that. Does my question make sense? Yes.
What do you mean by outsourcing sovereignty?
So in the Spur of the Streets, one of the points that someone would talk about, well, I was so glad I didn't have to make my own choice anymore. My priesthood leader or my husband would tell me what to do. And so that's like outsourcing the personal responsibility of decision making, or my read was, and I didn't articulate this because I'm so graphic with it, but the wanting, right? What are their factors? Yeah. And I guess that is straight about choice too, I think.
So to respond with again answering in not a day. What? No, this one actually is a fun. Well, that means is a quote from Chu that not a quote, but ironically, somebody who disconnects themselves from their own desires, from their own wanting, is arguably the most agentic of all, because now to have power over what you want, to decide I will make choices that I don't want, is strangely, if you think about desires as something that happens to you, then to reject them is very agentive, which is a long way of saying the reason I find wanting interesting is that often wanting is about, I'm not saying this very well, phenomenologically, to want something does not feel very agentive, but then to control your own wanting doesn't look very agentive. I think that's that's going back to the question of methodology. It's one of the really interesting tensions of what the subject experiences versus what the historian notices.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah.
You're killing me with my question is about desires changing. So when we look at the way women have expressed their desires or their wants, how do we take into account that those desires and wants may change, probably do change, and how seriously we take those? So kind of
Did you hear that at the back? Yeah. So how do we manage when people change their desires? As a historian, like negotiate, yeah, navigate it. Go ahead. Yeah.
This one actually isn't. We all before entering the program, she's initially had this boyfriend. He proposes to her, they're gonna get married. And if we presume that she's dating him because she likes him, she wants him on some level, we see her desires change, right? She's courting him, she wants him, she meets these co-wives who leave this really great impression on her about that in relationships, and then she brings up with Johnny because her desires change. She wants monogamy, something happens, and now she wants other things. How do we grapple with that? There's sort of two options. One option is to say, well, one of these desires was fake. You actually wanted something else the whole time. The other option is to say, like, no, a human being can fundamentally transform and change and want different things. So I think those in some ways are the two obvious options. Are some case to make that binarization idea any situation for this one. But one of those might be the answer. And I think which is the answer is more difficult question.
I have a book suggestion. And it's going to sound silly. There is a fantastic book that was published a few decades ago called Reading the Romance, which is about taking women's desires and their reading of romance novels seriously. And the author, whose name I cannot remember, did surveys of women about what they want when they read romance novels and then analyzed what was found inside. There's another edition that was published a couple of decades later where she went back and re-surveyed women to see how women's sexual desires have changed. It's really fascinating. I mean, she talks about the fact that romance novels are an escape for women. Women will talk about only wanting happy endings. And that part of what's going on in romance novels is that women, as they're struggling with monogamy, want to know that it's going to turn out okay no matter what happens. And that's why women read romance novels, or that there's a lot of like sexual violence in there, which she says is absolutely not about women wanting to be raped, but is about women wanting to be desired, but not to be held at fault for that desire. It's a fascinating book. And if you get the second edition, it talks about how sexual desire has changed over time. But it's a good read, even though it's a couple decades old at this point.
Any other questions? Yes, go ahead.
That's the wrap-up sign from.
Oh, that was a wrap-up sign. So not a question? No more questions then? We are done. Okay. Sorry. Maybe you can talk to the panel afterwards.
Are these papers available?
Are these papers available?
Mine was just written like 2 days ago, so no.
These pedestals and pulpits are my signature books, and mine is not.
You're in the same situation.
Well, thank you so much again.
Sorry, I already grabbed this
yep.
super fast.
Go ahead.
Now we have a 20-minute break before we have our keynote with Jennifer Finlayson-Fife. And I do hope that you will consider signing up for our email list if you have not already done so. I'm going to put a piece of paper out there on the table with a pen. So if you would like to know about events like this in the future, please put your email down. We'll get you on our list, and we will see you in 20 minutes.